Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us with this amazing anticipated conversation. David and I have been so excited to be able to have this conversation and bring it to you guys, audience, fans, guests. And today we have the pleasure of allowing you to get to know and meet one of the greatest icons and most prolific architects in the world, a man that needs absolutely no introduction. In honor of the Masters this week, the Tiger Woods of architecture. He's won multiple awards all over the place, and I'm sure you're all familiar with some of his projects, but they include the Apple Park, the MFA Boston, the British Museum, an extraordinary building, the HSBC Tower in Hong Kong, Wembley Stadium, the Hearst headquarters in Manhattan, and on and on and on, residential, commercial, workplace, absolutely everything. Without further ado, Lord Foster, welcome, and thank you so much for taking this time and joining us today on this opportunity to introduce you. So really, truly appreciate your time. How are you doing, Lord Foster? You're coming to us from Switzerland, from your home in Switzerland today, and how's everything going?
Very well, very well. Looking forward to talking.
Thank you so much. You guys, I'm a huge fan of Lord Foster's. I'm even going a little crazy here. And, I follow him on Instagram. For any of you that don't, you should. He's an extraordinary human being, just full, real true Renaissance man, cross-country skier, pilot, amongst, architecture and absolutely everything else. And so Lord Foster, tell us a little bit about how you began and your life and your inspiration and, where you're at, what's happening.
Doing what I enjoy doing, designing, working on projects. Where does it begin? Like most people at university, but perhaps a little later than most, late starter. Left school at 16, started university at 21, Manchester, and then a postgraduate at Yale University, which was extraordinary experience, and private practice since then.
Lord Foster, firstly, it's a pleasure to have you, and I reiterate every sentiment that Mauricio had said before. So thank you so much. I too went to Manchester University. I just didn't do the Yale part afterwards. But good job there. I want to know, and this is almost selfishly, but also probably selflessly, because everyone will want to know this. Your first project, from where did you start as far as your first architectural project, and how on earth did it lead to what you've achieved?
A friend at Yale University, a guy called Richard Rogers, we became close buddies, and we joined up afterwards. We created a practice called Team 4, which I, with my late wife, Wendy, that lasted from, let me think, 1961 to 67. And the projects were typical for a young practice. Friends, relatives would create projects. So the very first project was a tiny, almost, we called it a cockpit. It was on a sloping site in Cornwall. It was for the in-laws of my partner. We did a house there. That practice lasted from 1961 to 67. And then Wendy and I founded the present practice. It was known as Foster Associates. The only problem was there were no associates, there were no projects. And apart from a couple of students, we operated out of something called the Bed Sit in Hampstead, which is like a 2-room apartment in a residential area. And over time, that's grown, and we're now in many places around the world, and very much on the West Coast, I'm happy to say. which was an inspiration and is still an inspirational place.
We're thrilled that you're on the West Coast, and we're thrilled that, you know, we're having an opportunity to work with you on a project right now. It's been an absolute honor, and it's just incredible.
And I know that Lord Foster is going to be sharing some slides of some key projects that he's done for everyone to see. And I'm really excited about that. We've been talking about that. But I just need to ask you a question before we do that. What was your first big break? Because we know that you started obviously relatively humbly in a bedsit in Hampstead. By the way, I grew up in Hampstead. I didn't know that. So I will never look at Hampstead the same again. But what was your first big break? Because we're speaking about the British Museum. We're speaking about Apple Park, you know, Parliament in Berlin. How does that happen?
Well, one of my students, his father worked in Docklands, London Docklands, which of course no longer exist. And he said that the shipping line, which was a company called Fred Olsen, Norwegian company, they were looking to do a small amenity block. I mean, showers, toilets, and they were going out to builders. So I got, through this student, an interview with the dock manager. But I arrived an hour earlier. So I started to look how, and I'd never been to Docklands before. So I started to look how the trucks moved, how the boats unloaded. And I got this interview. And I mean, the Docklands at that time was pretty awful. I mean, it was the kind of epicenter of industrial unrest. It was probably the poorest area in London. Dockers would queue up every day for work. There was no security. And so this guy said, you know, you're an architect. I don't need an architect. I mean, I need a builder. So I got him to explain exactly what he wanted. And he pointed, drew me to the window, he pointed in the distance, and he said, and, you know, we're going to revolutionize the docks. We're going to provide new standards, and we're going to start with, you know, with proper showers and bathrooms, and it's over there. And then, so I started to say, well, you know, your people in the docks, they work this way. The action is by the quayside. If you're going to have them walk that distance over there, and by the way, your administration is here, why don't you put everything in one place on the quayside? And that started a conversation because it stopped him in his tracks. I guess the thing is that when you're really enthusiastic about design, then any project, no matter how humble it is incredibly attractive and motivational. So it really doesn't matter about the size or the prestige. I probably put as much into that project. Out of that process came a revolutionary building that was technologically revolutionary and socially revolutionary. I worked with Fred Olsen, who was Norwegian. We broke through a lot of taboos. We put the dockers and management in the same building, which they said was socially impossible. So that building was perhaps, from my perspective, although it's long gone because that's now Canary Wharf, it doesn't exist anymore, and it was really quite tiny. But that was the breakthrough building because IBM visited it. We did a project for IBM. A company called Willis Faber visited it. We did a project for them. Sir Robert Sainsbury, I wasn't to know until much later, as an art collector with his wife, visited it and said, whoever did this building, I want them to do my museum. So that was the building, but probably in terms of a global presence, perhaps the Hong Kong Bank, because that was very much on the world stage. And in many ways, that reinvented the concept of a high-rise building. So different buildings, different times.
Sure. Lord Foster, my good friend and developer Mauricio Oberfeld is asking if you could tell us about the tulip, and was it always the plan to have it follow and to be next to the Gherkin? What was the design process for that particular building?
That came out of a new owner who said, you know, I really want to expand the attraction of the building. It's really become a kind of international icon. And the reality is that that building is very, very much fixed in its time and its concept. You can get limited public access to the pinnacle, which is unusual because you get this incredible view of London and the region. So you get an interesting perspective on London. But what we demonstrated was that the site boundaries would enable you to do something which was a public addition to the building. So that was really that's coming much later after the birth of the building. The building was originally, I still call it Swiss Re, but that's a kind of private code name because it was originally commissioned by Swiss Re. It was then sold on. It was quite interesting. It was demonstration perhaps of flexibility because it was an owner-occupier building, and it's subsequently, you know, its real life is multi-occupancy, which is quite an interesting thing in terms of development, because you normally think of an owner-occupier building as being so customized that you can't split it up for multiple occupancy, but it has stood that test.
Amazing.
Should we move on to your, I mean, we have so many questions already happening, but I can see us ending up on a, just a full Q&A. And I know we've prepared, you know, you have some amazing stories to share with us with your, you know, some of the images that you're going to show and talk about, you know, the Apple Park and stories with Steve Jobs and all kinds of different things. So should we move on to your presentation, or what do you think about that?
Why not? I'm happy to do, you know, any format that you, I mean, I just put some images together of 5 projects. 2 of them were our workplace projects, and 3 are residential. I thought that on the West Coast, that Apple Park, and really my first meeting with Steve Jobs in September 2009 was going to be a 1-hour meeting, and it turned out that we spent all day together, and then our families came together over pizza in his kitchen, and the conversation about the project continued. So the birth of the project was Steve recalling that in his youth, this was the fruit bowl of the United States. And so the conversation was, you know, could one, in a very urbanized part of California, could one rediscover the California landscape? And we all know that it's a circular building, but that's kind of circular concept took 9 months to evolve. And I did this kind of cartoon that shows the evolution over that 9 months. And you could say that the site was one inspiration that was, as it were, looking at the project from the outside inwards. But if you looked at what generated the project internally, it was something Steve called the pod. And that was a relationship between a team space and 2 rows of cellular spaces for programmers. And the eureka moment was when all those different kind of geometries on the site, there's one in the center, which we call the propeller scheme, finally the eureka moment was when it clicked into a circle. And just to go back and look at the site before, the site is a pretty typical subdivision of 24 buildings, half the site covered by tarmac and parked cars, probably 1/5 given over to landscaping. And if you superimposed the circular building on that, it would look something like this. And so the transformation was really about greening the site and recreating that landscape of Steve's youth. And that would be really the amenity. It's no accident that it's called Apple Park, but rediscovering that landscape. And so the transformation from 24 buildings to 8 buildings, this being the dominant building, and going from half the site covered with tarmac and parked cars to virtually eliminating tarmac, bringing in 10,000 trees and dominant landscape, and interestingly, 12,000 people. Now, there's a very interesting illusion here, because when you look at this as if you're in a helicopter, it looks really dominant. But if you go inside that circle, then interestingly, the building almost disappears. It becomes very much the horizon. You're even more aware of the mountains in the distance. This is kind of about 1/4 mile across, and the building kind of perimeter is about 1 mile. But if you think of this as bringing everybody creatively under one roof, then it's arguably the ultimate compact building, because it's about proximity, it's about contact. And if we moved outside that circle, we moved to the other side of the buildings, then visually, the building is a kind of incident in the landscape. And so if you kind of zoom in to the building in the background, then one of its signature features are these eyebrows. They reduce glare. They're about linking the world of nature outside with the inside. So if I move behind those very, very long curved panels, and they're about 55 feet long, something that's never really been done before, that wall just kind of evaporates. And you start to see that eyebrow is pulling the landscape in. It's reflecting it, and it's bouncing light. And at the top of that wall is the way in which the building breathes. And so this is a climate-controlled building. It's totally energy sufficient. So it's harvesting all its energy through photovoltaics, through fuel cells, and it's working with nature. So if I took a slice through this edge, you would see at the top of the glass is where the air comes in and moves through the building. So kind of close up, this is what we would start to see. So there are filters in there. So this building, instead of like an old style air-conditioned building, which is recirculating refrigerated air around, this is breathing. So if this was a workplace for Steve Jobs and it's in a California landscape, what happens if you apply the same thinking, the same philosophy, but with a very different individual, Mike Bloomberg, on a very different site, right in the middle of a very the middle of capital city, London, in the city of London, the historic core. And here it's a different kind of outside space, but it is still using the elements of nature. It's using trees. It's working with an artist, Cristina Iglesias, on water features. So it's about people coming together. It's about public space. It's about amenity. And in the background, you can see an arcade which cuts through a very traditional device. So it's about dissolving the private world of Bloomberg with the public world outside. And in a different way, the facade, those elements in bronze, so the palette of materials here is very much influenced by its historic setting. It's using the same stone as the historic buildings, some of the historic buildings around it. And these enable the building to breathe. And like Apple, it's quite a deep building. And if you took a slice through the building, then it would look something like this. And here you can see the way that the air moves through. You can see the pedestrian spiral at the heart of the building, which is connecting all the 10 levels. But socially, everybody in this building, no matter what level you work on, or if you're a visitor, you all have to go through the social heart. And if the social heart of Apple was Apple Park, where everybody would gather in the landscape, then here, the social heart is something called the pantry, which is at level 6. And so this is, with more time, I would show you that if you turned around and looked towards the camera, you would see St. Paul's Cathedral captured as part of the kind of picture of this space. So this is the kind of living, breathing heart. Everything that you see here was specially designed for the building. So that ceiling, if you zoomed up close, you would see it was made of small petals, aluminum petals. And those petals were either cooled or heated to modify the climate. There are 2.5 million of them throughout the building, and 1 in 5 has a small illuminating element. So this is reducing the conventional energy loads, but it's giving something that is far more attractive. And if you add up all the sustainability elements here, this is the most sustainable workplace on record so far, with something like a 98.5 rating on the BREEAM scale. So in many ways, these as healthier buildings working with nature have been fringe buildings in the sense that they are created working with patrons who are concerned for the health of the workforce. They're both owner-occupied buildings. One could make a speculation that this would become much more mainstream in a post-pandemic world where there will be a legitimate demand, especially amongst younger generations, for healthier building environments. And anticipating a last image, I'm frequently quizzed, like many of us, what do you think the workplace, do you think the workplace of the future has a future? My point would be that the pandemic has not changed anything. What it's done, it has accelerated, it has hastened trends that were already apparent. So yes, people have demonstrated the ability with the technology to be more effective at home. A third place is attractive, whether that's the electronic Starbucks or a retreat in the country, much more flexibility. But people will, I believe, still want more than ever to come together socially, creatively, and the social dimension, which brings people together to interact creatively, will be more important than ever. So in that sense, I choose these two buildings because I think they anticipate some of those trends. If I took that theme of nature and landscape, then nowhere is it more apparent than perhaps in Los Angeles. And on this site in Beverly Hills between Santa Monica and Wilshire is an extraordinary site of 17.5 acres, and unusually and very progressively, one single developer. This was the outcome of a competition that we won, is in the advanced design negotiation stage. It comprises several hotels, two buildings of apartments, which you can see in this image here. But the emphasis is on nature, on landscape. The boundary between the architecture and the landscape dissolves. The same two themes, really, as in Apple, and in a different way, the urbanity of London, but ambiguously on this 17.5 acre site. And here, is the architecture the landscape, or is the landscape the architecture? 4.5 acres of this will be publicly accessible, and 3.5 acres will be private gardens for those who are staying in the hotel or have residences there. So 8 acres, more than half of the site given over to gardens, to botanical gardens. If I move to a more personal domain, this house on the left.
Allow me
Sorry.
to for one quick second, just because I'm just fascinated by this and I'm going crazy. But I had the pleasure of visiting the Bloomberg building, and pre-COVID, just pre-COVID, and now being able to listen to you and what you've done is just an absolute inspiration and tremendous. I actually admire it and a lot more than I did back then. Post-COVID, you designed it pre-COVID with a lot of post-COVID ideas, and kind of, as you said, the way of the future. Would you have done anything different now, post-COVID, to that building or to the Apple Park building or any of those in terms of sustainability and that you didn't do then? Or today, is it kind of the same type of thing anyway?
With more time to ponder that question, the response might be more considered and more in depth, but just completely off the cuff, no, I would not. And why do I say that? Both buildings are very permeable, so you can move through them in many different ways. For example, Bloomberg, you can walk up the spiral, or you could take the elevators. The elevators are dispersed around the edge. Remember, this building is the opposite of a conventional building. Conventionally, you gather everything together into one central core. You put that in the middle of the space, and people move around it. The move away from that started with the Hong Kong Bank, where you fragment that, you move it away, and you create flexible loft-type space. Now, the advantage of flexible loft-type space and dissolving the centralized system of movement gives you many more different movement paths. So it's better in an emergency because you have more escape routes. It's better in a post-COVID situation where you want people to separate in a way. You don't want them to congregate. So all of these things are working in a holistic way. So Bloomberg, no. Apple, similarly, you have different entry points around the perimeter, and you can reconfigure space. So the Hong Kong Bank did something that a high-rise had never done before. It took a dealer's floor into a headquarters building. Again, the reason was because you had open, flexible space, you had eye-to-eye contact, which is the essence of a dealer floor, communication. So I think that all of these buildings seek to anticipate change. I mean, if I showed you the building which I mentioned earlier, somebody visited Olsen, we created a headquarters for something called Willis Faber, still very much an active building. That building was born in the age of the typewriter. And when they had the 25th anniversary, they invited me back, and the ex-chairman, who then was a gentleman farmer, said, you know, Norman talked about flexibility, and we kind of humored him. But we never knew that one day, very, very shortly afterwards, that there would be the digital revolution. And we were the only company that didn't have to build a new building, because we had this capability of being able to thread cables under the floor. It wasn't a full access floor, but every 5 foot, you could bring up a cable. So the digital revolution was absorbed within this flexible building.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I know Benny Allingem is listening to us right now, and I invited him and told him that we were going to be talking just a little bit about 9900 Wilshire and the project that you guys are building there. And I've had a chance to go through that, and that's just an extraordinary project. I think that'll be amazing for Los Angeles and Beverly Hills. And so we're really looking forward to seeing that built. And Benny, if you're listening, I got to tell you, Lord Foster does a much better job of presenting it than you do. I'm sorry.
Lord Foster, I can actually see this property, and I know you've shown it before. I believe it's Cap Ferrat, and I believe it was your personal residence. Is that correct?
It was created for my wife and our very young family at the time. We outgrew the house. I never show a private home internally, that is. So this is no longer our home, but it's still very much there on Cap Ferrat. And it was an unusual situation, because that particular strip of coast, which was our favored destination as a vacation home, you couldn't build and you couldn't demolish. The controls were so tight. And I took a very nondescript old kind of masonry tower structure that had been very badly converted in the 50s. It was really quite tiny, and nobody reckoned that you could ever create a proper home out of it. And I managed to squeeze into this very, very small space over something like 7 levels, a vacation home. And just to really give a glimpse, because this is very much a response to a south of France, Mediterranean coastal site. And again, working with nature. How do you control an environment, but really work with it in terms of outdoor living? So the entry from the road is quite high above the ocean, which you can see in the distance here. So the entry level, everything is literally stacked on top of everything. So the swimming pool is the roof of the garage. The floor of the garage is the roof of the first level. And so if you entered the house at the swimming pool level, and so this is the roof of the garage. And if you entered and looked down, you would see the equivalent of a 4-story space. There is a level below this, so And this was down to millimeters. And then if you move down to the main living area at the bottom and you looked out towards the ocean, then this would be the facade. And really at the touch of a button, you could move the shading away. And also at a second touch of the button, you could move the entire 9-ton wall away. So completely dissolving the boundary between the inside and the outside. We moved from there, and I thought that just a glimpse of where I'm talking from here in Switzerland, and a very different response to a totally different kind of site, and a building which is prefabricated out of timber. So you can see our home under construction on the left. This was revolutionary more than 20 years ago when we fed information from the computer directly to a factory in Germany, which prefabricated the elements. So that's the second image from the left, but we combined that with the traditional handcrafts of timber shingles, absolutely traditional, with a family spanning 3 generations, and using cut out of 80 local trees at the same altitude in large shingles. So the whole building is encased in these very traditional shingles. And I made a conscious decision. So the balconies here face the view and face south, so they absorb the sun in what can be frequently a very cold climate. And rather than treat the timber, I encouraged it to change over time. And if I showed you an image of this building when it was first built, it would be a different color at the top. So it's weathered, and very much here you can see the balconies which open up to the view of the mountains and the sun. And I talked about the materiality of this building. If I look close up, so there are literally 250,000 of these small traditional shingles, hand cut and hand applied. And that really was the last of the projects, but not the last image. The last image is a response from a fellow Royal Academician. The Royal Academy in London is an institute on Piccadilly, goes back to the 18th century. Traditionally, it has a summer show that's been delayed to the winter. And we were, a group of us, the architect members, were asked to contribute something that would be optimistic about a world after the pandemic. And I did a poster, and that poster is really a graphic, a visual, but it has embedded in it a number of messages. And I'd be happy to talk about those messages. One, I think I've already said, I don't think it will change, it will hasten, it will accelerate trends. Buildings will be more healthy, I've talked about that. Cities will be greener, more walkable, bikeable. Farms could be more likely, for a variety of reasons, urban rather than rural. Food would be fresher. Work will be at home, and the third place, but very much the usual place. Moving will be faster, cleaner, safer. Trade will be more local and less global, but hopefully the big issues will be global. I'm happy to elaborate.
We would like you to elaborate.
Would you like me to move the image or keep the image?
No, I think we could probably just have the slideshow taken down, and just we'd love to listen to what your elaboration is on each of these points. That would be fantastic.
Well, I think if mobility becomes cleaner, more electrified, if it becomes more autonomous with artificial intelligence, then you move into a new kind of mobility. Younger generations do not have, I see this in my own growing children who are in their late teens, early 20s. I see it in their friends. I see it as a trend. There's less interest in ownership. There's much more interest in mobility on demand, whether that's Uber, Lyft, or you put all these factors together, the ability of cars to platoon, nose to tail. And so in a car-borne city like Los Angeles, does the commute become the new leisure time? And as you move into away from fossil fuels, whether that's through new generation nuclear, but that's another subject and has a lot of taboo associations. If you see all the advances, the acceleration of renewables, of solar, then you have less byproducts of fossil fuels, less fertilizer, water starts to become more scarce, hydroponics, the obsolete car park, which is no longer required because a fraction of the space, which currently is in huge proportion given over to movement, whether that's parking, roads, the whole infrastructure of car-borne mobility could be transformed. So the city arguably could be revolutionized by greenery, which again is absorbing carbon dioxide, creating a healthier, quieter, more livable environment. And we're seeing those trends were evident before. All that I'm describing is not new. Hydroponics, in terms of the potential for urban farming to deliver fresh food on the urban doorstep at a fraction of the cost with more flavor, fresher. All of these trends were evident before. But you're now seeing at huge scale pavement widening, increasing in bike lanes, these things which were the subject of much debate, time consuming, those things have happened overnight. Whole areas of central London in Soho, roads have been given over to pavement cafes, to strolling. And so this is, we are seeing those tendencies on a global scale.
Which is amazing. And one thing that really resonated with me was that you were saying that this pandemic, this COVID situation is not actually changing, it's just speeding up the process of where we would be anyway. Is that right? Almost
Absolutely.
a catalyst.
Yes. But, accelerating at a huge pace of change. But then, at the end of the last major pandemic, although there have been unpublicized pandemics of greater severity, even in the 1950s. But if we go back to the well-chronicled 1918-1920 pandemic, which claimed the lives of millions, the hallmarks of the period that followed that, the Roaring Twenties, was the building of new kinds of architecture that were literally invented after that, almost invented. The department store, the mega cinema, the sports stadium. These were bringing people together, gathering together in close proximity as never seen before. So what are the hallmarks of our period? I think it's mobility of movement, of information, and so I think that we're starting to see the symptoms of that revolution already. whether it's in its early stages, whether it's Hyperloop, which, you know, through my practice I'm involved with, whether it's the rebirth of the monorail, which with my foundation and the project team I'm involved with there. And it's interesting, I mean, if you go back into the science fiction of my youth, the monorail was one of the signatures of a science fiction future. So the potential for something like that to be reborn is, and so we're also seeing, in a way, the again, not the rebirth, but the re-emergence of the neighborhood, the potential to be able to do a lot of things within easy walking distance without necessarily having to get into a vehicle, hail a cab, get into a car. So I think when you add all these tendencies together, I think they have the potential for a very humanizing force.
What a perspective. It really is quite incredible. Mauricio, I know you wanted to ask some questions because we have a lot of them and we only have just over 10 minutes left. So we wanted to get as many in as possible. I'll kick off with one if that's okay.
Please do. We have a lot of questions. I mean, they are rolling in. I can't even tell you. People are just absolutely fascinated. We have guests from Tunisia, Guinea, Argentina, Switzerland, your neighbors. I mean, it's absolutely Ireland, absolutely everywhere. And they are rolling in fast and furious. So, go for it, David. You start with the first one.
Well, I think just your perspective that you shared with us just now, Lord Foster, is almost a blanket for any COVID-related question, and thank you so much for that. But I think that one question that has been asked is, people want to know about the Norman Foster Foundation. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that? Because obviously it's a big project close to your heart, and we'd love to know about it.
Sure. It's headquartered in Madrid, but it has a global reach. It has at its heart an archive which is based on a lot of what I've been talking about this evening. It has a very strong educational emphasis, an educational program. It creates workshops which bring together 10 top graduates from around the world, every continent, with experts in the field, mentors. It was launched with a major forum in 2017 in the Royal Opera House with a largely youthful audience of several thousand. And it has a project group which has been working in slums, for example, in India, demonstrating the potential to be able to renew a slum community from within, to demonstrate that these are communities of hope and not despair, as an alternative to the very traditional move of destroying that community, bulldozing the community, and then relocating, often with dire social circumstances. So it's a multifaceted foundation, which is very much about anticipating the future and seeking to educate, to promote future civic leaders. So in a nutshell, that's a kind of cross-section of its activities.
Fantastic. Just always improving the world.
My business partner, James, just very quickly, just sent to our group chat. He said, Norman Foster is mind-blowing. and Taylor from my team just said, he seems like a mystical character. I love him. Well, I think that echoes everyone's sentiments. I just wanted to share that because it just popped up on my screen. But Mauricio, sorry to interrupt.
No worries, man. That's just the same comment that we're constantly having. And I just hope we can get to everybody's questions here. But Damien Newman asked an interesting question here that caught my attention. An architect's sketches are part of their identity, from pianos, green sketches on a piece of folded paper to your wonderful pencil sketches in your notebooks. This is a funny question. In your notebooks, do you also write to-do lists and mundane things next to your drawings, or do you reserve those pages for ideas?
It's a total untidy mix. which gets completely out of hand. So I even have problems unscrambling it myself. So it's it's really just a personal habit. I carry an A4 sketchbook. I write reminders, I write letters, I do sketches. The sketches could be from whatever is around me, or more likely something that I'm working on right at that moment. So it's very, it's very spontaneous. And as you turn the pages, some of them are absolutely, you know, horrible, sort of untidy. It looks as though spiders have been at work, dipping into ink trays. And that can be alongside something that's really very, very considered, because in a way it's a sort of distillation of a form of communication with colleagues. So a mixture of styles.
I love that. Do you actually have your notes for every single project that you've done filed somewhere?
I even have the notes for
Oh, I love it.
Would love a copy of that, Lord Foster.
Lord Foster, Jeff Cole's asking if you've ever had an actual conversation with Elon Musk about the Hyperloop and what that looks like.
Yes, my wife and I met Elon, and we had a great conversation together right at the end of his production line, the Tesla production line, in the California facility. So we were kind of driven seemingly endless miles to the end of the production roll-off, and so yes, that was a memorable exchange.
I'm certain of that. David, feel free to comb through these questions with me as they're coming in. But
yes, sorry, a lot of them are compliments as well, by the way. So, but what I will say, and you've given back so much through your creating, Lord Foster. You've given back to communities intentionally and inadvertently, just with what you've created, which is incredible. And just speaking of that, someone's popped up and said, any advice for current architecture students? And I don't think that there could be a better person to inspire and answer a question to a student.
It's interesting. I described this forum in 2017, and so I was part of a panel on the stage with, and I'm trying to think, there was an artist, there was Mike Bloomberg, and one of the questions from the largely student audience was, what advice would you give a student or somebody graduating from a school of architecture? And I said I'd give them the same advice that I give myself: stay a student.
Mm.
Okay. Well, when you say stay a student, I'm assuming the way I'm going to.
I mean, in the sense that you know, remain curious, question everything, challenge everything, and you know, whether so I think in that sense, you know, graduation seems like as if you're moving from one world to another. The reality is that nothing changes. Everything changes, but nothing changes. So what I'm really saying is, staying a student is about attitude of mind, and it's being a good listener.
It's a very humble statement coming from yourself, Lord Foster. So I think that was beautifully answered. Thank you for that. Someone said, I was amazed on how you place solar panels in the circular way. I was wondering, how effective is it, since usually solar panels are only placed on the side where the sun goes up and down?
I think it's a very, very good question. And it's, I mean, interestingly, a project that I'm still working on, it's still finishing on site, which is a foundation project. It's a gathering place for think tanks, for an artist or a writer in residence. And that project, instinctively, the solar panels went on the roof. And then over the kind of development of the design, you realize the roof is determined really by the people within the building and the view. And that gives it a particular easterly emphasis. But really, in solar terms, you want the southern emphasis. And that led, and it's a kind of perfect answer to the question. The southern edge of the site has become the solar field. And of course, the solar panels, and this is something we discovered through Mazda in the desert. And the desert is a dusty place. The roof is really the last place you want to put solar panels, unless you're happy to have people up on the roof dusting off all the time, which is largely inaccessible. So it's much more, if you have the space, and it's a big if, and in the example that I'm quoting, we did have the space, and the southern boundary, as it happened, is not where the view is, but it's the ideal place to harvest the energy. So yes, it's a very pertinent question.
Well, we're reaching the end of our hour. I want to try something. We've never tried this before, but I'm gonna. There's a few people that have raised their hands and actually would like to ask a question. So I'm gonna pick one here. Let's see how that goes. Michael Bloom, you're now please, I'll unmute you. Michael, are you there? I've never tried this before, Lord.
Well, I've got his name on the screen, so.
Michael, can you hear us? Are you?
I'm not sure if he's unmuted, Mauricio.
I guess I don't know how to do this. Sorry, let me try that, but we'll do that again. Any last words you want to leave us with? I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And is there anything else that you'd like to just kind of leave the everybody?
No, I just think it's great that you tie in an audience from so many different places to talk about a subject and a range of subjects that, you know, is uppermost in all of our minds. It's our, you know, everything that we've been talking about is linked to climate change, and climate change is the big issue. And so whether it's healthier buildings, whether it's reducing carbon in so many aspects, and it's, you know, I think the last image was really saying, in an ideal world, we would be more autonomous. We would have more control over the growing, the powering, all the local issues, but collectively we would be working together on the big issues of the day, whether those were the health issues, whether they were climate change, the big issues that confront humanity, you know, need all the skills across the globe. So in an ideal world, you would have the best of local and you'd have the best of global.
I love that. Great way to leave us. And Lord Foster, on behalf of David and myself, we cannot thank you enough for your time, your inspiration, your motivation, and may we all strive to be better people as you're teaching us now. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lord Foster, and thank you everyone for participating.
Bye, everyone.
Have a wonderful evening.